Today's episode of the Culture Study Podcast is sponsored by The 19th. The 19th is an independent, nonprofit newsroom whose reporting centers those who have been traditionally shut out of politics and policy. Ahead of the election, The 19th wants to help you make sense of how people from underrepresented communities are impacted by U.S. politics and policy. Women's rights, reproductive rights, LGBTQ plus rights, they're all on the ballot this November. I love The 19th. I really do. And it's like the only newsletter that I actually open. And they're always approaching stories through a lens that I don't see elsewhere. I mean, they have reporters who are completely dedicated just to thinking about caregiving, which is not something that you're going to see at most news outlets. You can also listen to The 19th's podcast wherever you're listening to this one. Erin Haynes, who's an editor at large, she's so awesome. She's also the host of The Amendment, which sheds light on our politics during a critical election year where the work of our democracy is still unfinished. So ahead of this election this fall, subscribe to The 19th's free newsletter. It's at 19thnews.org/culture study to stay informed on the issues that represent those underserved by and underrepresented in American media. That's 19th News, 19th News. 19thnews.org/culture study. Thank you so much to The 19th for sponsoring today's episode. Okay, today we're talking about the Hulu show Secret Lives of Mormon Wives. And to start, we're going to describe a moment that made you raise your eyebrows, drop your jaw. I was watching this show with my partner, Charlie, and I would say moments when he's like, what the fuck? But you go first.
That is such a good question because one of my central gripes with the show is that I didn't have enough of those moments.
Yes. But
I guess one that was just like, ooh, they skirted over that really quickly and that felt bigger was, I think it's Michaela. She had her first kid at 16 and that's really skimmed over really quickly. And that to me was like a big let's slow down and pause on that for a hot second.
Also, Demi's husband is 18 years older.
Oh, that's right.
And this isn't clear in the show, but he used to be married to a Real Housewife of Salt Lake.
Oh. I'm actually surprised they didn't capitalize on the drama factor of that.
I know, right?
Also, Demi's husband was on Claire Crowley's season of The Bachelorette, but he dropped out. So he loves his reality TV.
Melody, do you know who submitted him for that season?
No.
Demi and her then husband.
Whoa. Oh my God.
Oh my God.
I know. They ran into each other at the gym. So sorry, I just was again reading an Us Weekly summary of this. They ran into them at the gym, Demi and her then husband, and Demi had been starstruck by him because he was a BYU football player when Demi was 9, and they were family friends. So they ran into each other at the gym, and and then we're talking about they wanted to get Demi's daughter into modeling, and somehow there was a connect there, and the husband had recently become divorced and or separated, and they were okay, they secretly were we're going to submit him to The Bachelor.
Wow.
Uh-huh.
Wow.
Well, and that's why I think actually part of the fascination with this show stems from how many layers there are if you start Googling off the show. And that's not unique.
Right, to reality TV.
To the show by any means, but there's the narrative and then there's the sub-narrative that grabs people and heightens the melodrama and contributes to the feeling that oh, I'm going to text my friend and tell them about this piece of information that changes your understanding of what you saw on the screen.
Yep.
This is the Culture Study Podcast, and I'm Anne Helen Petersen.
I'm Sara Petersen. I wrote the book Momfluenced: Inside the Maddening, Picture-Perfect World of Mommy Influencer Culture. And I also write a Substack called In Pursuit of Clean Countertops, which is an interrogation of the ideal mother.
I should also note we both spell our name Petersen with an S-E-N. And people often wonder if we're related. We are just both Scandinavian.
And we both struggle with stringy hair from time to time.
Just like so thin. Oh my God. It's just like always, for me personally, just like always aspiring to the blonde of my childhood.
Always. It's bad.
So we will get into the hair of it all when we talk about this show. So we've been wanting to have you come on the show to talk about momfluencers, and like there is sometimes a fatigue amongst our listeners, not all, but some, about just the conversation of trad wives. And some people are just like so bored with Ballerina Farm.
Yep.
Even though she's not bored with post content.
Right.
But I wonder if, just to get us started until we get into like the show, if you could describe how Secret Lives of Mormon Wives intersects with this world of momfluencers. Because it's like, I mean, they call themselves MomTok.
Right. In terms of the Mormon momfluencers I typically do cultural deep dives on, they're in a sort of different category. They're big on TikTok. I tend to focus on, the visual curation that happens on Instagram. They're not trad wives in that they're not following a trad wife aesthetic. They're not wearing gingham. They're not on big farms. They're not rocking their just milked warm milk, raw milk. And they read much more like, Kardashian aestheticized style influencers than they do Mormon mommy bloggers.
Yeah.
So I would say that's a huge distinction right there. They also grew to fame from, traditional like TikTok dances rather than mommy blogs, or rather than really, narrativizing their family story as this ideal nuclear family mythology in a way that, Hannah Neeleman certainly did.
Yes.
So, I think there are a lot of distinctions to be made there in terms of the mom talkers versus the classic trad wife, Mormon mommy bloggers.
Well, and I'm even thinking about the distinction versus like coming to fame on TikTok versus coming to fame on Instagram, in terms of like so much more investment in an actual active, like a video, right?
Yes.
And yesterday Charlie was like, no, really, did they just dance? Like that was the thing.
Right.
And I'm like, well, a lot of people on TikTok become famous just by dancing. So that's not unique. But I think what distinguished them is people are like, oh my gosh, these Mormon moms are hot. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like there was this like exoticism going on, which we'll talk about more. And also they're young.
Yeah.
And a
very,
lot
very young.
And so like it makes sense that they were doing this on TikTok. If they were people who were invested in social media, like, you're not on Instagram making like static posts.
Right. For sure.
Like, yeah, they're in their 20s. They're young. There's a reason why. And all of the shots on the show, they tell us how old everyone is.
Mm-hmm. They also, when they were, growing MomTok into this, social media juggernaut, they very explicitly played with their Mormonism as a way to, gain relevance and gain eyeballs. They were very tongue-in-cheek about it, and I think that was like a real strategy.
We should rewind just slightly. I can hear Melody's voice in my ears saying, what is the show actually about? So do you want to start that, and then I can add to it?
Sure.
Okay.
If you've seen any of the Real Housewife franchises, I would say this is that plus a little more Mormonism. Yeah. It's got all the trappings of a traditional reality TV show. It's got, the montages to make sure we know exactly where they are, which is lots and lots and lots of, screenshots of the Mormon temple, of photos of Jesus Christ. But it's really just a classic, talking to the camera, interview style reality TV show following these housewives, some of which are not, none of them are really housewives. Most of them are the breadwinners in their family. And they're all moms. Not all of them are married. So, but it's really just Real Housewives with a higher Mormon flair, I would say.
Yeah, and the way that the show starts, like the narrative tension to start the show, is that one of these moms who is involved in what they called MomTok.
I really dropped the lead, didn't I?
One of these moms a few years ago went on TikTok and revealed that everyone in this MomTok group, this is not even true, but like she said that like some of us essentially were swinging. And by swinging, we later learned that the understanding is that they were making out with other husbands with their husband's knowledge, like at a party, like they were having like a party and like made out with other husbands. And there might have been some oral sex involved. It's never super spelled out. Like some of them speculate a little bit about it because most of the women on this show were not involved in that scandal.
Right.
The narrative tension is like the woman who did that,
Taylor Frankie Paul,
trying to figure out what her place is again in this group, in Mormonism, in her family. She's an incredible protagonist, I would say. Very complicated. And then the rest of the show, like at one point, the episode that I recently watched, it was like, oh, we're divided between the saints and the sinners.
I can't.
Like the good girls and the ones who like trust the boundaries a little bit more.
Yeah.
And yeah, I guess like the driving narrative tension is like, what's the future? They keep asking, like, and there's a lot of jokes.
Of
like,
MomTok?
What? Is this the end of MomTok?
Exactly.
And everyone's like, we don't care. Like, those narrative stakes are so. I'm like, I don't care about any of that.
Yeah,
I care about whether Jen and her husband break up. That's like much more interesting to me.
Well, and I think it's telling that when you asked for my description, none of that came to my mind because the stakes do feel so orchestrated.
Yeah.
And they do feel so low. Whereas, yes, when it comes to Jen and Zach, like the stakes are really high. And like, that was really, I mean, I got invested in multiple storylines, but that one was the one that was like, yeah, this is where we can actually dig into the gender of it all. And in Mormon marriages that I think so many of us are really interested in.
Were you aware of like the drama, like the swinging drama when that happened?
Yes, but I didn't write about it, again, because they're like not my flavor of Mormon momfluencers that I typically cover.
Yeah.
I was aware when it happened. I like lightly followed it, but yeah, I didn't write about it at the time.
Yeah, and the other thing we should say for people who haven't watched this show is that like aesthetically, you likened it to the Kardashians or a Housewives franchise. I think that is part of the titillation value as well, is like all of these women are groomed in a way that we would expect. Groomed, and also like they get plastic surgery and Botox and other, like the way that they do their hair, the way that they dress, like it looks like they could be Kardashians.
Totally.
I think that to me was somewhat surprising that like so much, especially if you've watched other Mormon shows, like there are a lot of shows that focus on Mormons because American audiences are compelled and bewildered by Mormons in many cases. And we'll get into all of that. But like it's a different face to it that I think you might expect.
Yes. And, the women themselves say that sort of repeatedly, like, we're creating this new narrative for Mormon women. We're breaking out of this, which we'll get into. We're breaking out of this box that the public has been trained to see Mormons. I think that also the aesthetic, I guess, surprise of the show, I think has also led many to sort of say, like, how Mormon are they really? And like, how representative are these women of, typical Mormon housewives, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, we got nearly 100 questions, and I would say that half of them were, how Mormon are these women, right?
Yeah.
Which, okay, we'll table that for now because I think we're going to address it in the questions. So of these questions that we received, we're going to lump them into 3 categories. Logistics of the show, the way Mormonism is represented in the show, and the way feminism, I'm putting it in quotes, is represented in the show. So... First, we're going to hear a question from Krista that will help us continue to lay out the stakes and the plot points.
how did these women end up together? How did they meet? What do they have in common? And then my other question is, how do they have so much money? I know they make money by being influencers, but they had to have had nice houses and nice stuff before they became influencers. So where did that come from?
Okay, what do you think here? Because I don't know exactly how they met, but I would love to hear.
They make quite a few references in the show to, when we met through our work. So I don't think most of these relationships were organic. I think most of them came about through social media. So that, I guess, is, one answer to that question. I think some of them might have had more organic relationships prior to social media stardom, but I think primarily they realized it would be advantageous to all of them to group together and sort of join forces.
Yeah, at one point in the first episode, they say, like, basically we have a content creation house, but we all live in our own houses.
Right.
And so that to me speaks to the fact that they like think of this as like, we get together once a week, a couple times a week, and maybe have our kids play together too. And then we like get ready for camera and do dances together.
Yeah, totally. I also have a whole rabbit hole that I want to go down at some point. Have you heard of Alyssa Grenfell?
No.
So I discovered her through Jamie Loftus's podcast, 16th Minute of Fame. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's really good. She basically does deep dives on like the internet's the main character of the day, like Bean Dad, for example, like The Dress. Do you remember The Dress?
Yes.
Of course.
Yeah.
But so she did a 2-part series on trying to answer like, why are so many influencers Mormon? And Alyssa Grenfell is an ex-Mormon. She's got quite a following on YouTube. And she's got this hour-long video where she pretty much lays out this theory. She analyzes... I'm going to go really slow because this is like math and my brain, it took a long time for me to like try to put this together because my brain just doesn't work with the numbers. But essentially advertisers will put money into certain key terms. It's like pay per click. And through these keywords, you can sort of tell like which keywords are most beneficial for advertisers. So she does this analysis. She compares the word Mormon to Catholic, for example. And advertisers are paying like circa $25 for the keyword Mormon. And they're paying like around $3 for the keyword Catholic. She also goes through and analyzes Utah influencer, LA influencer, New York influencer, and Texas influencer. These are all areas where influencers abound. And the Utah influencer keyword was around, I think, $20, and the other three were around $3. So generally her theory is that, even companies like Anthropologie, who are promoting like boho floral dresses, they can see that a huge sector of their target demographic is likely following Mormon mommy bloggers, which will raise the price for these keywords. So, and again, like she has no way of proving who's putting this money in, but she theorizes that the Mormon church itself is also dumping money into these keywords simply because they want to get as many members as they can. And they're really big on I can never pronounce this word.
Either can I, is it because we're Scandinavian? Proselytizing.
Yes.
Proselytizing.
They're famously big on that. So that is her theory. I just learned about this within like the last 2 days, but I find it fascinating. And I just think the cultural fascination / sort of darker interest in Mormonism is also playing a part. That it's not going to, if we're looking at a trad influencer who just lives in like New Hampshire and looks like a Mormon mommy blogger, but isn't occasionally dropping like LDS dog whistles, we're not going to be digging for like a deeper understory, I don't think, in the same way that we do with Mormon influencers.
The other thing, okay, just to like put some of our cards on the table, like I'm not Mormon, I grew up Christian, but I also grew up in Idaho, which has the most per capita Mormons in the United States, more than Utah. And the way that you know how many Mormons you were friends with was how many Book of Mormons you had inscribed to you as a non-Mormon person, because it's a part of the way that they try to introduce you to the church.
Right.
My best friend when I was 15, 16, 17. So I know a lot about Mormonism, and I also, like, because of that proximity, was always really interested in understanding it, and also like found it fascinating when I went away from Idaho in the Pacific Northwest and met so many people who didn't know any Mormons and didn't know anything about it, and really exoticized it, right?
Yeah.
Where I grew up, it was just what a lot of people were a part of.
Right.
So the intersection, because a lot of times I think there's this fundamental question of like, oh, well, if women aren't supposed to work outside the home, then why are they like making money as trad wives? And like positive representations of life as a Mormon are absolutely in the church's best interest. You know, there was when in high school, like there was tacit encouragement for all of my Mormon friends to be on basketball teams, be on volleyball teams, run for ASB, like be a leader in the community.
Yep.
And doing this work online, so long as you are in line with the tenets of the LDS Church, and we'll get in a second to the difference between Mormonism as culture and actually being a member of the LDS Church. Like, that's great. Like, be this beacon of light, you know?
Right.
So I think that, like, that's a long-winded answer how these women are, why they are online and how they met each other and why they have money.
Yes, totally.
Okay, I do have an additional prompt, though, from my understanding of Mormonism. Isn't wealth like a part of practicing the faith? Like, if you are wealthy, it's a sign that like you're divinely favored, but also they're encouraged to build up this worth because, you know, the world is going to end. They're going to be the only ones left. They have these pantries that are stocked to last them like 2 years. Yep. So there is an element of like wealth is part of practicing the faith, and then that gets passed down.
Well, it's like wealth, but it's not like it's not quite as brazen. I don't know how to describe this. Like, you need to have enough money so that you can have a big enough house to have all of your children. Like, if you have a lot of children, like, it is expensive to have a lot of children. And in many of these homes, not all, but in many of these homes, they're especially if you're a middle class LDS person, like, the mom isn't working because they're doing a full-time job of taking care of the home. And the preparedness, like, I think a lot of it is just like you are trying to be a pillar in your community. And it's not like, it's different than, I don't know, like the evangelical, like, God blessed me with this wealth. Like, wealth is a sign that I'm chosen almost, you know?
Right. Like the prosperity gospel.
Yeah, it's not prosperity gospel. Right. It's more like being stable is good, right?
Well, and there's also they're supposed to pay 10% of their income annually. It's a tithing. And
it's not optional. It's not optional. It's not
so the wording on the LDS website is fascinating. I mean, their website in general is fascinating, but it says it is, decreed by holy law. And so nobody can undo this law. However, you're not going to be like struck down by the church if you don't pay it. So they have this really interesting way of saying like, it's totally not optional. So you should do it if you can, but still come to church if you're not.
Well, and the other thing that is an important thing to point out is the Mormons have a social safety net like none other, right? Like, if you need help and you're like, if something happens to your family, like the Mormon church is there to help you in all of these different ways, financially, but also just as a support system. And, they have other systems of education and of summer care and all sorts of things that I have a friend who actually did all this reporting that's like, maybe Mormons are doing more interesting socialism than most of us understand. But you have to be a member of the church, right? That's part of the work.
Yep.
A lot of families have lost tremendous amounts of wealth and gone into crisis because of a one-time catastrophe, right? Yeah. And if that happens to you and you are a member of the LDS Church, there are people to pick up the pieces for you. So there's just the stakes are just different.
Yep. And I think that also makes it easier or more palatable for them to push their, conservative gender roles because feminists will, of course say, in response to these religions that are telling their women to stay home and devote themselves only to childcare and domestic work, what if your marriage crumbles? What will you do then? And I think the Mormons have this kind of nice answer to that, which is we'll support you no matter what.
Mm-hmm. Or also like the idea, there is a lawmaker in Idaho who stood up against accepting any sort of federal funding for early childhood care, because he said the quiet part aloud, like if we create care, then moms will want to go to work. Mm-hmm. And I think the national response is like, so many families need 2 incomes in order to get by.
Right.
But if you live in a lot of these places in suburban or rural Idaho or in Utah, you don't necessarily need 2 incomes. Right. And I think that also encourages that, like makes it possible so that women can live that lifestyle.
Right.
I guess I would say. Okay. Our next question is also about the money. This comes from Hannah.
Has social media influencing replaced MLM scams as the preferred way for a socially ambitious, middle-class Mormon woman to pull in money for her family without having the stigma of working outside the home? It feels like most of these women on the show would have been selling LuLaRoe or essential oils a decade ago.
100%.
Yes. Well, and, some of them are doing both, we should also say. Like, the MLMs are not really going anywhere amongst the Mormon housewives. But yeah, it is very much a similar business model. Like, the top influencers are making a ton of money, but the vast majority are not making enough to live on. The vast majority.
Yeah, but it is pocket money, right? It's essentially part-time work in a society that does not make space for part-time work or for flexible work.
Right.
And that has long been the attraction of MLMs in really destructive ways, I think.
Yeah. Yes.
And also, in some ways, like influencing recreates the strong and expansive networks of the Mormon Church, but does it in a way that's like more national. Mm-hmm. Because so many more people can access your content than like just your Facebook friends or like the members of your ward, right?
Right. Well, going back to Alyssa Grenfell, she made this other really interesting point that many of, the most famous Mormon influencers start with these much smaller blogs that are much more specifically tailored to Mormon audiences, simply because the people in their community are Mormon and they know they're going to come in for that, clean Mormon content. And then as their platforms grow, the Mormonism becomes much more of an afterthought because they know that it's not appealing to a lot of mainstream audiences. You look at Ballerina Farm and we all know she's Mormon. She occasionally posts, temple content or, Mormon wedding content, but it's not nearly as big of a focus as it used to be.
Yeah. The next question we're including just because it made Melody snort. So this is a common question when it comes to reality TV. This comes from Mitzi and Melody's going to read it.
How much do we think they're getting paid to be on this show? Is it reasonable to assume Dakota is just a C-list paid actor and that's why he's such a hollow character? He just seems fake, but obviously brings a good storyline to Taylor. My boyfriend would certainly step aside for $200,000 and let the TV world think I was dating a baboon for a year.
Dakota.
I hate him so much. The first time that he came on screen, I was like, that guy's squirrely. I don't trust him.
Yeah, I mean, from second one, the amount of, one thing that really, his whole emotional abuse tactic with quote unquote commitment was really, really red flaggy. His constant I'm tortured by this. Why can't you commit to me? Bad news. But yes, hollow. I would agree with that assessment in terms of his character.
But I don't think he was paid. I think that a lot of the women on this show, and they actually talk about this, don't have sex education and don't have a relationship with birth control. And thus, she found herself in a toxic relationship and then got pregnant and couldn't extricate herself from that relationship.
Yeah.
Okay.
Heavy sighs all around.
I know. Okay, so let's move on to the second bucket of question, the way that Mormonism is portrayed on the show. This question from Maddie is a great way to get into it.
What makes someone Mormon? Is it just believing in the Book of Mormon? Do they have to abide by the beliefs and the practices of the church? I feel like some of these women wouldn't be considered Mormons by other Mormons because they don't seem to follow the rules of the church. Is the show really about Mormon girls gone wild, or is it actually just about a group of women that live in Utah and don't follow the same rules as their neighbors? Is the idea that they're Mormon just there for an intriguing title?
Wow, Maddie, just like getting at everything here.
Yeah, I love that question.
I mean, my first sense after thinking about this for a while is that everyone on the show is culturally Mormon. They have either grown up in Mormon homes or, in the case of Layla, converted to Mormonism. They are surrounded by Mormonism, right?
Yep.
Like Mormonism is the dominant culture, the way that someone would say, like, Catholicism is the dominant culture in various neighborhoods in Boston.
Right.
Yep. Or like, I don't know, Lutheranism is the dominant culture in areas of Minnesota.
Yep. I think that's right.
And so I think some of it is this slipperiness between Mormon culture. And we should be clear here that members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints are no longer supposed to call themselves Mormons.
Yes.
This came down from the prophet that they should now call themselves members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, right? And I think some of that message was to create this distinction between like the culture that is Mormon, right? And we like just that phrase almost.
Mm-hmm.
And then this more formal word, which we can use to describe people who are what is sometimes called within the church TBM, true believing Mormons or true blue Mormons, like, which I think there are maybe two people on the show who could be categorized, or maybe three.
Right.
Yeah. What do you think about this?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly very explicit and, sometimes complicated barriers of entry to, quote unquote, becoming a Mormon. There's like an endowment ceremony. There's lots of like counseling with church elders. So I do think, certainly converting to Mormonism is a series of steps that you have to actively take. But yeah, I think you're right. I would say most of these women just grew up in Mormon culture and are culturally Mormon. But yeah, I mean, many of them don't go to church regularly, as they openly say in interviews. But it's interesting that I've read the same thing about the church no longer wanting to use the word Mormon. It's fascinating to me because that word is what is bringing in so many eyeballs to the church in the first place. Mm-hmm. So I just find like the LDS's relationship to publicity really, really interesting because they want it very much, but yeah, I mean, they simply can't control what kind of publicity they're getting. And I think statements from the prophet saying like, we're not going to use this word anymore indicate that discomfort with the lack of control they have over their own publicity.
Yeah. And also, some people, we got a couple like conspiracy questions that are like, is the church actually funding this show? And I think some of those questions, I mean, there are conspiracy questions about like the way that Catholicism works, the way that like evangelical churches work, like it has to do with, there is a lot about the church that is not known to people who are not part of the priesthood. There are things that you learn when you turn a certain age, and there are things that you learn when you are invited, like when you have a temple recommend, like when you can go into the temple. Yeah, I just think that there's this like you said, like the church itself has a complicated relationship with publicity and has very publicly denounced this show.
Right. Without naming the title
Without
of the show.
naming the show. Just be like, people are interested in us because we're so popular. And then like depict things. But I think one of the things that a lot of listeners were trying to get to is like, are they excommunicated? And I don't think, like, from what I can tell, the answer is no. None of them have been excommunicated. And you can be excommunicated for sexual sins. I think it really, like, there is no governing body that is like, you're out and you're out and you're out. It really depends, like, ward by ward, what the bishop decides. Like, sometimes people can get excommunicated for having premarital sex, and sometimes they can confess their sins and be welcomed back into the fold. And, like, someone like Taylor could be, like, if she's like, I want to come back to this belief, like, you can do that.
Right. And that's also good for the church's image.
Yeah.
And they can offer that up in response to, I don't want to minimize people's, like, very real, like, there's a reason people have the quote unquote ick when it comes to this church. Like, there's a lot of not great stuff. And again, I think to your point, many Christian patriarchal religions have lots of dirty laundry. But I mean, you know, they didn't admit Black members until I think 1978. And that was in direct response to diminishing numbers in membership.
Yeah.
They explicitly opposed the Equal Rights Amendment. They pretty much have a don't ask, don't tell policy when it comes to queerness. So, like, there's a lot of not great stuff. And I also think the fact that it's a relatively new religion makes it easier for us to look at the origin story, you know, with the golden plates and, of course, their relationship to polygamy, and say, like, this is really weird, this is really culty. And, yeah, some of the secret ceremonies, like, the women, as of, I think, 2019, had to wear veils over their faces in certain church ceremonies. There are all these, like, it's very easy to go down a Mormon rabbit hole, I guess is what I'm saying. There's also the money factor. They're worth, like, I think it's $265 billion as of 2023. So all of these pieces together, it just makes complete sense to me why people are looking for insidious motives behind church leadership. And yeah, I guess I just don't want to disregard the conspiracy theories as, like, completely out of left field.
Not at all. I just, like, I think that people learn one small part about the religion and are like, that's fucking crazy. You know what I mean? They're like, they have to wear garments. And I'm like,
right.
Like, but, like, there's just so many things you can point to that are more normalized and acceptable parts of other Christian religions.
Yeah, that's a great point.
That because they're more commonplace, they're not thought of as that ick. Do you know what I mean?
Right. Like, even, you know, the Catholic, like, eating the blood and body of Christ, for example.
Like, that is super weird.
Yes.
Like, yeah. So, and I grew up Christian. Like, I know the ways that these things are normalized. You're like, oh, and then there was an ark. Like,
right. And then there was an ark. I mean, the Virgin Mary. Like, it's just like, you would go on and on and on.
Yeah. But I think, like, basically every religion, there's real problems with its handling of how to deal with people who aren't like them.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And also with conquest and with conversion and forced conversion and all sorts of things. So, yeah, we're on the same page there. Okay, so let's see. Next question. This comes from Hillary.
A common theme of Mormon shows seems to be that women especially are rebranding a refutation of key tenets of Mormonism, drinking, sex, women as humans, as Mormon 2.0, when it's just not really being Mormon. Is it cultural attachment and fear that keeps them from just saying, like, I'm a Protestant now?
Okay, so here's an interesting moment in the episode when they're talking about the sex toys and whether or not Whitney's trying to decide whether to do do the endorsement for sex toys brand deal. In some of the conversations, she's like, yeah, you guys, like, we want to create a different picture of Mormonism. And they're like, and the price is right?
Exactly.
Like, there's never any, like, disarticulation between, like, I will do this for this much money. Or, like, if you give me this much money, I can, like, come up with an argument on why I should do this. at the same time, there was this really interesting conversation between Whitney and her mom and her much younger sister.
Yep.
And Whitney was like, Mom, I didn't know anything. I did not know anything about sex. I was a virgin on my wedding night. Like, it was horrible. And the mom's like, I had a toddler. Like, sorry, I wasn't mom of the year telling you about how to have sex on your wedding night. Which complicated. And also says, like, Whitney says, like, you know, sex toys have been really useful in my marriage and figuring out sex, like how to have good sex in my marriage. And to me, this conversation pinpoints a really fundamental tension that's also at work in other forms of Christianity, and I think a lot of religions, which is like you have to demonize sex at all costs.
Yep.
Before marriage, and then suddenly it's like sex is the glory. Like it is worshiping God to have beautiful sex. Like it is if you are an incredibly faithful person, then you will have great sex.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. Yeah. There's Layla. I think it's Layla had never had an orgasm before.
Yes.
But yeah, it is this huge disconnect in so many Christian religions. Like total abstinence, total ignorance, and then like be a porn star for your husband, essentially.
Yes.
Like I think Jen, like they're talking about like who sends the most like naughty selfies. And I think it's Jen who is married to, you know, the worst husband of them all. I think we can all agree.
Yes.
But yeah, it is this really fascinating, like, I think it feels like my sexuality and my like sexual prowess belongs in some ways to my husband because it only belongs within marriage.
Yeah.
And it's only acceptable within marriage. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I did think that scene was interesting with Whitney's mother because I think she said something to the effect of, you know, if I could have done things differently, knowing now how you felt, I probably would have. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that was interesting for sure.
But like, are they actually trying to be progressive or are they trying to like just be secular and say like we want to live secular lives and this is how we be like, you know what I mean? Like, are they just like trying to shoehorn themselves into Mormonism by saying like the way that I'm living my life right now is Mormonism 2.0, right?
Yeah, I mean, they say so many times, like they're just beating that drum throughout the whole show about how they're trying to pave this new path forward for Mormon women. Mm-hmm. And I think it does read pretty hollow because, like, these aren't typical Mormon women in that they're, you know, highly visible, highly financially successful influencers. I mean, yes, a lot of influencers are Mormon, but they're public facing in a way that many Mormon housewives are not. And I think it's also just good for their business to have a very clear narrative about their Mormonism. And their narrative is that they're doing things differently. Who is it? The one with the really long, this is not good. I was just going to say the really long blonde hair.
Yeah,
but
no.
she's the blondest. Oh, what is her name? The blondest. Neely? Something Neely?
Macy.
Yes. Okay. So
who's very interesting.
Yes. And she is sort of, you know, classic white feminist boss babe where she opens up it's called Baby Mama. It's products for the whole natal experience. And she says, I think the show shares a still from one of her TikToks where she's like, you know, I'm a CEO now of my own company and they're really into talking about how they're the breadwinners for their family. But by adhering to very, very specific beauty norms and standards of femininity and working within capitalism, like that's how they're able to do this. They're not they're not changing any of the rules for the vast majority of Mormon women, I don't think. And they're not publicly disavowing the church either. Even, I think Jessie says, like, you know, she's the one that drinks occasionally.
Yeah.
And I think
she's actually like not involved in the church at all anymore.
Right. She's the one that owns the hair extension company and salon.
Yeah.
But, you know, she said she doesn't go to church anymore and she doesn't agree. You know, a couple of them call the church misogynistic, or at least their views towards women misogynistic. but not so much that they're publicly disavowing, their connection to the church. So I think it's just interesting that they use their Mormonism on whatever scale it exists to create a brand and to create these businesses. And they're leaning on mainstream culture's knowledge of these, usually retrograde gender roles within Mormon relationships as a way to say we're different, when in fact, I'm not sure how different they really are.
I think in basically every way they want to have their cake and eat it too, right? Yeah. Like they still want to be associated with cultural Mormonism because it is exotic to mainstream audiences.
Yep. And to advertisers.
But they don't want to be like subject to the specific demands of Mormonism.
Right.
Right. And they also don't want to publicly critique in engaged ways that would jeopardize like their standing with their culture, right? Like with their friends and family and their communities.
Yeah.
So I think that like they want to have all of those associations.
Yep.
And keep them all active at the same time.
Yep.
And that's too why like they all like are moms, right? And they all are heterosexual, and they all like there's not a lot of busting of the status quo going on here, but I think making that claim that like we are expanding the understanding of what a Mormon can be also sends this message to a certain sort of consumer, like a certain sort of person who's watching their TikToks that are like, look, she's kind of feminist, right? You know what I mean?
Yes. And I think even though the church like has spoken against the show, again, without naming the show explicitly, it could also be another soft way of reeling people in. If, the average gal who's looking to have a good time and, not just pray about how many children she's going to have, which as far as I can tell, I was doing a deep dive on the LDS website. Like, I think that is their recommendation, that you pray on it. And it's kind of your responsibility to have as many as possible, especially if you have the means to do so. They explicitly talk about child bearing as like a religious responsibility.
Yeah.
So I think it could be for some like, oh, I can be Mormon and not do all the shitty stuff. Like I can only like Whitney when she's, she announces her pregnancy, spoiler alert, at the end of the series, her third pregnancy, and says like, yeah, it's going to be our last baby. Like that kind of isn't classically Mormon of her in many ways. I think a lot of it is like, what have mainstream audiences been trained to see as quote unquote classically Mormon?
Right.
Which is in many ways these really hyperbolic narratives, like the ballerina farm narrative, like 8 kids is a hyperbolic number of kids.
Or it's FLDS, it's fundamentalist LDS, which is also not Mormonism, right? Like, and that's the thing, like, I think some people are like, if they're not wearing like actual prairie dresses, right, and have long hair and are practicing polygamy, like that is the actual Mormonism in some way. And that's incomplete, like, that's just not true.
Right.
So, yeah, there's like these two poles that are both represented most often, or like that we see represented most vividly, I would say.
Yeah.
Okay, our next question is going to get into some things about agency, and this kind of reminds me about some of the conversation we had about Dallas Cowboys cheerleaders. Let's hear from Elise.
I can't stop thinking about the idea that, is someone oppressed if they don't know they are oppressed? Is it subjective? And only once you learn more or get out of the situation, then you start calling it oppressed? If you perceive it as your choice, you are not oppressed? Thinking in terms of Jen from Mormon Wives, but also Ballerina Farm. And why do they, bend over backwards to protect the men in their lives? How do we help them see it happening? In another vein, I grew up Mormon and married Mormon and do not have this relationship with my husband. We are no longer strong members, but attend occasionally. He would not have batted an eye about Chippendales, but I also believe the Mormon Church cultivates men and women like Jen and Zach. But men and women like that exist outside of Mormonism too. So what's really going on here?
Whew. The first thing I'll say for people who haven't watched the show is there is this whole subplot later in the season where essentially there's like a girls' weekend in Vegas, and they go to a Chippendales show, and Jen's husband, who is incredibly controlling, and she feels weird about going, and she doesn't actually end up going, but then, and he's also, sub-narrative, out gambling with the money that she makes. And gambling is also not something that you're supposed to do if you're a Mormon.
Right.
And there's a whole back and forth, like, where he essentially is like, you're a horrible person, I should leave you, like, all these things. Okay. So this first part of this question, though, is something that I think you grapple with all the time, which is this balance of feminism that's like, if someone is choosing it, then it's their choice, kind of, right?
Right. Yeah, this came up a ton after the Times profile on Ballerina Farm. In particular, in response to her response to the profile, in which she was like, this was a hit piece. This person twisted our words. This life was my choice. I love this life. And I think particularly when we're talking about white women, they can participate in cultures that oppress women if they are reaping benefits from that same power structure.
Totally.
It's exactly like girl boss feminism. Like, if a woman enters a business as a CEO and continues to pay her employees badly, ships for free and doesn't pay the people working in the shipping
is a horrible,
units.
Abusive boss.
Yes. Thank you. Like, if she's still continuing to maintain an abusive power structure, it's not intersectionally feminist.
No.
And I think white femininity is a really powerful tool to be wielded. It's always contingent on the person's relationship to white male power. Mm-hmm. And if that relationship crumbles, so does her power. So it's never true power. I mean, if we're looking at Ballerina Farm, again, as like just our go-to example of all of these things, if they got divorced, and those millions from the JetBlue dynasty were no longer accessible to her, what would happen to her custody? Again, with the millions of money on her husband's side, like, all of these things, all of this so-called power and all this so-called free agency are contingent on cooperating within an oppressive power structure and maintaining that through cooperation.
And I would say other women in her sphere, not like some of the people on the show, I actually think they encourage her, like, to see this abuse as abuse. There, like, I do think there are women on this show, particularly, again, they all look the same.
To me.
Yeah, and Macy, like, both of them, they're like, this relationship is fucked up and you shouldn't be a part of it, right?
Yes.
But in their actual cultural sphere, there are many more women who are saying, like, and also by example, like, if you get divorced, it's going to really suck.
Yeah. Right. Particularly for Jen, whose mother, again, the cultural power imbalance is there.
Yes.
Can't be overstated.
Yeah.
Whenever it comes to choice and agency within power structures that are historically and effectively bad for women, it's like always going to be a hollow type of choice, I think.
Yeah. I think, like, in a lot of high control religions, part of the way that control manifests, it's part of the doctrine, but then it also has to take place in the home. And so, like, as a man, you're taught, like, you are the head of your household. Like, these behaviors are normal.
Yep.
And so that, to me, I think, this question points out, like, the Mormon church creates relationships like that. And I think this is a relationship that, like, is particularly typical of high control religions, because it just is like a natural manifestation of that structure in action.
Right.
Okay. So I do think we need to address, like, the abusive component here a little bit. So I don't think we can talk about any of the feminism without also talking about, like, the very vividly displayed emotional abuse that's going on. So let's hear this question from Becky.
I thought this would be a fun watch, but I can't stop thinking about how controlling, abusive these men are. It's awful. Is there a question there? Agree? Disagree?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I mean, we definitely have to talk about Zach, but because I don't want to forget about this. There was one scene with Taylor and Dakota. She's like days away from giving birth. She's stated multiple times she's exhausted in every sense of the word, like multiple times. And Dakota shows up and she's like lying in bed and he's just been constantly haranguing her about, why can't you commit to me? Why can't we get married? And this is like, part a function of, Mormonism really wants you to be married if you're having a child together, but it's also a really effective way of him controlling her and exercising control over her.
Yeah.
And she's in bed and she's just tears are just silently falling down her face.
Yeah.
And he's like, I'm so sorry, babe. I love you and blah, blah, blah. But you got to commit to me. You got to commit to me. And it's like, that also was just clear abuse to me, clear emotional abuse to me. And yeah, I mean, a couple of the women in response to both Dakota and Zach, they say, well, Jen specifically says this about Zach. Like, I think his problem is that he cares too much.
Right.
And I think many women are, raised to view a man who is fiery, is passionate, and controlling as someone who just loves you so much.
Yep.
And, you see it in romantic comedies when the protagonist is essentially stalking the woman and ringing her doorbell. And, there's the book, what's the say anything where he has
Yeah. He's like,
it's just like, yes, like these are like soft forms of stalking. And, there's no consent from the woman in any of these scenarios. And yeah, I agree with the person who wrote that question. It wasn't fun to watch because of these elements. What did you think of?
I just think like a lot of these women got married very young and in many situations under duress because of a pregnancy or because they had gotten divorced and were still very young and needed to have a partner.
Right.
I do not think everyone who gets married young is emotionally immature, but I think that there was not a lot of space for them to figure out who they were and what mattered to them. And that now they are grappling with trying to figure that out, and a husband who understands them as a threat, right? Who understands like even them being on the show as a threat, right? Which is a perfect tee up to our next and last question. This comes from Elizabeth.
The money part was the part that I kept getting stuck on. These women are the breadwinners, and MomTok equals financial power. Yet, they are required to only express their power through looks, dancing, and momming. The men remain in charge. And all the men were so immature. So doesn't this show sort of prove that financial power for women is the greatest threat to patriarchy, the greatest actual threat, while demonstrating how patriarchy has made us our own oppressors? I mean, we are our worst oppressors.
Elizabeth, doesn't this prove? What a question. What's your response to it?
I mean, yes. Jen kept using the word tricky to describe the fact that she made money, essentially, and to rationalize Zach's really toxic response to that. She kept saying, like, it's tricky because in a traditional Mormon household, the man is the breadwinner and I'm the breadwinner. And, he's trying to go to med school, which she's, I guess, going to have to fund. But yeah, the other angle of that question that I really liked was they're making all of this money by performing good womanhood and good, motherhood, essentially, which is how so many momfluencers make their money, by essentially gaming the system.
Yeah, and I think that it's true, though, that like all of these relationships are somewhat destabilized, or at least from like the traditional poles of authority, by the fact that the woman is the most prominent, the most visible, bringing in the finances for the family. And so how do you react to that vulnerability and that like threat to your masculinity and to patriarchy? You have to be like, it's like a cartoon level of controlling.
Yeah. And there's also like a huge level of irony in the Mormon momfluencer boom is that the woman is the star of that show. The husband is always a background character. He's always boring in comparison to the momfluencer. It's just always the case. And
they're props. They are props.
They are
when
props.
they appear in the videos, they are like secondary character. Like they're not even characters. They are props.
Right. And if anything, they're only appearing as this sort of lip service to Mormon patriarchy to show like, here he is doing the man stuff. Here he is driving a tractor or whatever the fuck we're calling man stuff. But yeah. He's always just so irrelevant to the story.
Yes. Or he has an Instagram account called Hog Fathering. That's
the most boring of
Farm.
them all. Sorry, Daniel.
Well, we really covered so much, and there's so much more that we could talk about, and I really hope we do get into it in the comments on this one. Sarah, if people want to find more of you on the internet, where can they find you?
So my Substack is In Pursuit of Clean Countertops, and I'm on Instagram at @SLouisePetersen with an E, just like Ann Helen's.
I really cannot recommend the Substack enough. Like it's one of my favorite reads. And if you like any of this sort of conversation, then I really hope people go and check it out. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Culture Study Podcast. Be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts because we have so many great episodes in the works, and I promise that you do not want to miss any of them. If you want to suggest a topic, ask a question about the culture that surrounds you, or submit a question for our subscriber-only advice time segment, go to our Google form at tinyurl.com/culturestudypod or check the show notes for a link. And for today's AAA segment, which is for subscribers only, we answered a question from a listener who wanted to know if life is ever going to be easier. We have a lot of wisdom. Just trust us. If you want to support the show and get all of the bonus content, including the AAA segment, go to culturestudypod.substack.com. It's $5 a month or $50 a year. You get ad-free episodes, an exclusive advice time segment, weekly discussion threads for each episode, and a link to a special Google form so that your questions go to the front of the line. The Culture Study Podcast is produced by me, Ann Helen Petersen, and Melody Rowell. Our music is by Poddington Bear. You can find me on Instagram at Ann Helen Petersen, Melody at Melodious47, and the show at Culture Study Pod.